Every decision you made today, what you ate, what you clicked, who you agreed with. You think you made those choices. You didn't. And by the end of this video, you won't be able to unsee it. Here's what almost nobody tells you. There's a documented, peer-reviewed, Nobel Prize-backed science of how human beings are influenced. And it's been used on you your entire life without your knowledge or consent. Most people hear that and feel vaguely uncomfortable. Then they keep scrolling. But if you're still here right now, that tells me you're not most people. In 1984, psychologist Robert Cialdini spent years going undercover. Inside sales companies, pyramid schemes, advertising agencies, to document the exact mechanisms that make people say yes when they mean no. His book sold over 5 million copies. Then Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize, proving that your brain runs on two systems. A fast, emotional, automatic one that makes almost every real decision, and a slow, rational one that shows up afterward, just to write the story of why you chose that. What we're going to walk through in this video is not a self-help list. It is not a collection of tips. It's a complete map of how influence actually works, so you can use it, defend against it, and know, for the first time, exactly when someone is using it on you. There's one warning I need to give you before we go any further, because some of what's in this will change how you see people close to you, and that's a real cost. But first, let's start with the mechanism behind every single persuasion technique ever documented. It begins with something so simple, it's almost embarrassing. Chapter 1, The First Veil, the illusion of free will. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. Viktor Frankl. Let me ask you something, and I want you to take it seriously before you answer. When was the last time you made a completely free choice? Not a choice influenced by advertising. Not a choice shaped by what your friends thought. Not a choice nudged along by how the options were presented to you. A truly free choice, arising purely from your own uncontaminated will. Take a moment. Think carefully. Here is what the science tells us. That moment is almost impossible to identify. Not because free will doesn't exist. That's a philosophical debate for another book. But because the conditions surrounding every decision you make are almost always engineered, shaped, or at minimum influenced by forces you're not consciously aware of. In a now famous 1999 study, researchers Jonathan Lvov and Itamar Simonson demonstrated something remarkable about how the order of choices affects what people select. Participants presented with the same options in different sequences consistently chose different things, not because their preferences changed, but because the framing changed. The architecture of choice, not the choice itself, determined the outcome. This is what behavioral economists call choice architecture. And once you understand it, you see it everywhere. The reason milk is at the back of the grocery store is not convenience. It's because you'll walk past hundreds of other products to reach it. The reason default settings on software come pre-checked is because most users never uncheck them. The reason a wine list puts a $300 bottle near the top is to make the $80 bottle feel reasonable by comparison. None of this required force. No one held a gun to your head. But you walked down that aisle, you left that box checked, you ordered that wine, and you felt in every case like you were choosing freely, because you were. And yet the environment was arranged to make certain choices more likely than others. Psychologist Barry Schwartz, in his landmark book, The Paradox of Choice, showed that modern Western consumers are so overwhelmed with options that they paradoxically experience less satisfaction and more anxiety than people with fewer choices. In response, when they're given a shortcut, a default, a recommendation, a most popular label, they take it with relief. The illusion of freedom is preserved, while the actual decision is quietly outsourced. The invisible forces behind everyday decisions are not always sinister. A cafeteria that puts fruit at eye level and hides the candy at the bottom is using the same mechanics as a casino that hides the clocks so you lose track of time. The mechanism is identical, only the intent differs. And that is exactly the point of this book, understanding the mechanism so you can evaluate the intent. Here is the awakening. The strings are always there. What changes is who's pulling them, for what purpose, and whether you can feel them at all. Most people move through life confident in their autonomy, and this confidence is not entirely wrong, but it is incomplete. The beginning of real psychological freedom is the uncomfortable acknowledgement that your choices have been, and continue to be, shaped. That acknowledgement doesn't make you powerless. It makes you the one person in the room who knows where the levers are. In the chapters that follow, we'll map those levers one by one. But this first veil, the illusion of free will, is the most important to name because it is the foundation on which all other influence rests. If you were fully rational, fully conscious, and fully resistant to external framing, most persuasion techniques would simply fail, but you're not. None of us are, and that's not a weakness. It's what makes us human. The goal is not to become a machine. The goal is to become a witness to your own decision-making, curious, observant, and ultimately more free because of it. Chapter 2. The second veil, the fragility of the mind. The human mind is a story processor, not a logic processor. Jonathan Haidt. I want to tell you about a study that has haunted me since I first read it. In 1974, psychologists Elizabeth Loftus and John Palmer showed participants footage of car accidents and then asked them questions about what they'd seen. So the key manipulation was simple. Some participants were asked how fast were the cars going when they hit each other. Others were asked the same question, but with one word changed, smashed instead of hit. The group that heard smashed estimated the cars going significantly faster. 1 week later, when asked whether there had been any broken glass in the footage, there was none. The smashed group was more than twice as likely to say yes. One single word altered what they believed they had seen with their own eyes. This is the fragility of the mind. Not stupidity of the mind. Not gullibility in some embarrassing sense. This is the fundamental architecture of human memory and perception, which is constructive rather than reproductive. Your mind doesn't record events like a camera. It builds them, piece by piece, filling in gaps with expectations, suggestions, and prior knowledge. Every time you remember something, you are rebuilding it, and the reconstruction is vulnerable to influence. Kahneman's research, which earned him the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002, describes this in terms of two systems. System 1 is fast, automatic, emotional, and largely unconscious. It's what lets you drive a familiar route while thinking about something else entirely. System 2 is slow, deliberate, effortful, and analytical. It's what you use when doing long division or reading the fine print of a contract. The problem, as Kahneman documented exhaustively, is that System 1 does about 95% of our cognitive work. System 2 is expensive, tiring, and we avoid triggering it whenever we can. This means that the vast majority of your judgments, assessments, and decisions happen before your rational mind ever gets involved. And by the time System 2 shows up, it is mostly in the business of finding reasons to justify what System 1 already decided. Emotion is the hidden ruler of human reasoning, and this is not a flaw to be ashamed of. Emotions evolved before rational cognition did. They are faster, more energy efficient, and often remarkably accurate. Gut feelings encode enormous amounts of pattern-recognized experience, but they are also manipulable in ways that slow deliberation is not. Fear, desire, belonging, pride, disgust. These are not background noise. They are the primary signal that human decision-making runs on. Consider what happens when someone feels financially anxious. Research by Sendhil Mullainathan and Eldar Shafir, published in their book Scarcity, showed that the cognitive load created by scarcity, whether of money, time, or food, actively diminishes, measured EQ scores, and reduces self-control. The mind narrowly focuses on the immediate problem, leaving less bandwidth for everything else. A person in this state is significantly more vulnerable to short-term thinking and impulsive decisions than they would be in calmer circumstances. Why certainty is often manufactured is perhaps the most disturbing insight here. People are deeply uncomfortable with uncertainty. It triggers anxiety, which System 1 reads as danger. So when a figure of authority, a smooth-sounding presentation, or a confidently repeated claim offers certainty, the mind rushes toward it with relief, regardless of whether that certainty is warranted. This is why confident lies so often outperform hesitant truths. Confidence is a social signal of competence. It reduces the listener's cognitive burden, and a mind that is tired, emotional, or overwhelmed is a mind that is grateful for anything that makes the uncertainty stop. The cracks in human reasoning are not rare and personal. They are universal and structural. Understanding this, truly understanding it from the inside, is the beginning of something important. Not cynicism, not paranoia, but a genuine curiosity about the machinery running beneath the surface of every conversation, every advertisement, and every choice you make in the supermarket or the voting booth. The mind is fragile not because it is weak, but because it was built for a world that no longer exists. A world where fast emotional responses saved lives. In the modern world, those same responses are frequently exploited. The first defense is simply knowing that. Chapter 3. The Third Veil. Emotional Dominion. People will forget what you said. People will forget what you did. But people will never forget how you made them feel. Maya Angelou. There is a moment in every heated argument where you can actually feel your thinking change. The blood rises slightly. Something tightens in the chest. And suddenly the words you're using are sharper, faster, less measured, as though a different version of you has taken the wheel. That's not a metaphor. That's neuroscience. The amygdala, an almond-shaped cluster of neurons deep in the brain's temporal lobe, is one of the oldest structures in the human brain. It processes threat, fear, and strong emotion before your prefrontal cortex, the seat of rational deliberation, even receives the signal. In conditions of emotional arousal, the amygdala can effectively hijack higher cognitive processing, producing what neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux called the low-road response: fast, automatic, and largely unconscious. What this means practically is that emotion does not merely influence thought, it can temporarily replace it. When you are angry, afraid, ecstatically happy, or deeply in love, you are operating with a significantly altered cognitive instrument. Decisions made in this state often look different in retrospect, sometimes embarrassingly so. The currents beneath conscious awareness that emotional influence operates on are not always dramatic. Fear and anger are the obvious ones, but subtler emotions, belonging, status anxiety, mild curiosity, low-level desire, are just as powerful because they're harder to notice. You don't feel yourself being moved by them. You simply find yourself wanting something, agreeing to something, or avoiding something, and you construct a rational explanation afterward. In a landmark study conducted at the University of California, researchers showed that simply manipulating the emotional state of a participant before a negotiation dramatically altered the outcomes. People who were put into a mildly positive mood were more flexible, more creative, and more cooperative. People put into a negative mood became more rigid and adversarial, and crucially, neither group attributed their behavior to their mood. Both believed they were responding to the situation at hand. The anatomy of emotional influence runs through several documented pathways. One is emotional contagion, the unconscious mirroring of the emotional state of people around you. You have likely felt this at a funeral, a sports game, or a powerful concert. Mirror neurons in the brain facilitate a kind of emotional synchrony between humans, which allowed our ancestors to coordinate, bond, and cooperate. Today, skilled communicators, politicians, salespeople, performers use this mechanism deliberately, projecting emotional states that audiences unconsciously absorb and reflect. Another pathway is the transfer of emotion onto unrelated objects. Advertising is almost entirely built on this principle. A car commercial doesn't argue for fuel efficiency. It associates the vehicle with freedom, with attractive people, with the feeling of being desired and successful. The emotion attaches to the product without the viewer consciously noticing the transaction. By the time they're standing on a dealership lot, the emotional association is already embedded. When reaction precedes thought, the person being influenced often never realizes the process happened. The decision feels intuitive. It feels right. It feels like their own preference, arrived at independently. And in a technical sense, it was their own emotional architecture produced it. But that architecture was first played like an instrument. Understanding this does not mean suppressing emotion. Emotion is not the enemy of good judgment. It is an essential component of it. Antonio Damasio's research on patients with damage to emotional processing centers showed that they became profoundly unable to make decisions, even simple ones, because they lacked the somatic markers that tell us what matters. The goal is emotional literacy, the capacity to recognize which emotion is running in a given moment, where it came from, and whether it is pointing you toward or away from your actual interests. That literacy is itself a form of power, quiet, internal, and nearly impossible to manipulate from the outside. Chapter 4. The Fourth Veil. The Mask of Authority. Authority without wisdom is like a heavy axe without an edge. Anne Bradstreet. In 1961, before the Nuremberg trials had fully faded from public memory, a Yale psychologist named Stanley Milgram wanted to understand something that had been troubling him: how ordinary people could follow orders that caused obvious harm to others. What he discovered sent shockwaves through the social sciences that have never fully stopped reverberating. Participants in his experiment were told they were assisting in a study on learning and memory. An authority figure in a white lab coat instructed them to administer electric shocks of increasing voltage to another participant, actually a Confederate actor, whenever they answered a question incorrectly. The shocks weren't real, but the screams were convincingly recorded, and the voltage labels went all the way up to XXX, danger, severe shock. 65% of participants administered what they believed to be the maximum voltage. They expressed distress. They hesitated. Some asked to stop. But when the authority figure calmly insisted the experiment requires that you continue, most of them continued. This was not a finding about cruel people. These were ordinary Americans, teachers, engineers, accountants. What the Milgram experiment demonstrated was the extraordinary power of perceived authority to override individual moral judgment, not through threat or coercion, but through the mere presence of a credentialed figure expressing calm certainty. Power without substance, the ability to command compliance based on symbols rather than actual competence, is one of the most efficient mechanisms in the human social toolkit. We evolved in hierarchical groups where respecting authority figures was generally adaptive. The person who knew where the water was, who had survived the most winters, who wore the markings of a successful hunter. These were good people to follow. The problem is that the symbols of authority have become decoupled from actual knowledge. The white lab coat confers credibility regardless of whether it is worn by a surgeon or an actor. The confident baritone voice, the tailored suit, the title printed on a business card. These are all signals that trigger automatic deference responses in an audience that has not paused to verify the underlying competence. Robert Cialdini documented this in a study involving medical professionals. When a doctor with an unknown name called hospital nursing staff with instructions to administer a non-standard medication dose, 95% of nurses prepared to do so, despite hospital policy explicitly prohibiting compliance with telephone orders from unknown callers, and despite the dosage being twice the recommended safe limit. The doctor's title alone was sufficient to override judgment, protocol, and concern. The construction of perceived control follows predictable patterns. Voice modulation, specifically speaking more slowly and at lower pitch, has been shown in multiple studies to increase perceptions of authority and trustworthiness. People who make fewer apologies, who occupy more physical space, who make and maintain eye contact with confidence. These individuals are consistently rated as more competent, regardless of what they actually say. Why people submit to certainty is perhaps the deepest thread here. Uncertainty is cognitively expensive and emotionally uncomfortable. A person who projects certainty, who doesn't hedge, who doesn't apologize, who answers questions with confidence, whether or not that confidence is warranted, relieves the listener of the burden of uncertainty. The relief is automatic. The deference that follows is almost reflexive. The practical implication cuts both ways. If you are trying to be heard, to lead, or to protect people who depend on you, understanding how authority is communicated is essential. And if you are trying to protect your own judgment, learning to ask the question, not does this person project authority, but does this person actually know what they are talking about, may be the most valuable cognitive habit you ever develop. Chapter 5, The Fifth Veil, Scarcity and Desire. Forbid us something, and that thing we desire. Geoffrey Chaucer. In 2009, researchers at the University of Amsterdam conducted a simple experiment. They gave participants a jar of cookies, either a jar with 10 cookies or an identical jar with just 2. The cookies were the same, the jars were the same. The only difference was quantity. The participants who reached into the nearly empty jar consistently rated those cookies as more desirable, better tasting, and more valuable than those from the full jar. Nothing about the cookies had changed. Everything about the perception had. This is the psychology of scarcity, and it is one of the most powerful and reliably exploited forces in all of human behavior. The evolutionary explanation is straightforward. For most of human history, resources were genuinely limited. Food could spoil. Seasons changed. Rivals competed. A mind tuned to assign extra value to things that were rare or disappearing was a mind that survived. In the modern world, marketers, salespeople, and platform designers have weaponized this ancient circuitry with extraordinary precision. Only 3 left in stock. Offer expires tonight. Limited edition. Sold out in your area. Each of these phrases is a small artificial scarcity signal, injected into a context where the underlying product may be infinitely reproducible, and the deadline entirely manufactured. Amazon's website has been documented displaying only 4 left in stock. Order soon messaging even for items that are mass-produced and available from dozens of competitors. Ticketmaster has been criticized for revealing artificially limited seat availability to create urgency in ticket buyers. Online travel sites display messages like only 2 rooms left at this price, and researchers at Cornell University found that these notifications, regardless of their accuracy, dramatically increased booking rates. Urgency as a silent pressure operates not just on the desire for the thing itself, but on the fear of regret. Loss aversion, the tendency to feel losses about twice as powerfully as equivalent gains, is one of the most robust findings in behavioral economics. Kahneman and Tversky's original research demonstrated this across cultures, ages, and contexts. We are not primarily motivated by the desire to win. We are primarily motivated by the terror of losing. Now or never thinking exploits this asymmetry. When the possibility of loss is introduced, the emotional cost of inaction suddenly rises sharply. The thing you were considering becomes, in that moment, the thing you cannot lose, and the window is closing. Desire intensified through limitation follows a principle that goes beyond commerce. Psychological reactance, the emotional response to having options restricted, was first described by Jack Brame in 1966. When people feel that a freedom or option is being taken away, they want it more, not less. This is why forbidden relationships feel more intense, why censored books become bestsellers, why telling teenagers they cannot do something is often the fastest way to ensure they do it. The beautiful and slightly troubling thing about scarcity effects is that they work even when you know about them. Being told that a limited availability message is artificial does reduce its impact somewhat, but not entirely. The emotional pull of potential loss persists even in an educated audience because it runs at the level of System 1 before System 2 can intervene. What you can do is pause, create space between the trigger and the action. Specifically ask, is this scarcity real or constructed? Would I want this if there were unlimited supply? Often the answer changes everything. Chapter 6, The Sixth Veil, Invisible Obligations. No man is more cheated than the selfish man. Henry Ward Beecher. Somewhere in your past, someone did something for you that you didn't ask for. Maybe they brought you coffee when you were having a bad day. Maybe they offered to help you move, or passed along a job lead, or simply paid the check before you could reach your wallet. And in the aftermath of that gesture, however small, you felt something a warmth, yes, but also a subtle pressure. A sense that something was now owed. That feeling has a name. Researchers call it the reciprocity norm, the deeply embedded social rule that when someone gives us something, we are obligated to give something back. It is one of the most universally documented social principles across all human cultures, described by anthropologists in societies from hunter-gatherer communities in Papua New Guinea to corporate boardrooms in New York. Cialdini documented one of the most striking demonstrations of reciprocity in the context of the Hare Krishna Society in the 1970s. Members of the organization began approaching travelers in airports and, before making any request, placing a small flower in the person's hands. Many travelers immediately tried to return the flower. The members would refuse. "No, it's a gift for you." The result was a dramatic increase in charitable donations, even from people who had initially been hostile to the approach, and even from people who privately found the tactic annoying. The gift had created an obligation that felt genuine, that felt self-generated, regardless of whether the recipient had any desire to receive the gift in the first place. This is the mechanism. Uninvited giving creates a sense of debt that the recipient feels compelled to repay, often at a value exceeding the original gift. How giving creates unseen bonds is particularly visible in sales and negotiation contexts. Free samples are not marketing kindness. They are calculated investments in reciprocity. Research has consistently shown that receiving a free sample of food in a supermarket dramatically increases purchases of that product, far beyond what can be explained by the informational value of tasting it. The obligation to reciprocate, triggered by the gift, does most of the work. The weight of psychological debt accumulates across relationships in ways that can subtly reshape power dynamics. A manager who takes the team out for drinks creates a diffuse sense of obligation. A friend who constantly pays for dinner may be, consciously or not, accumulating social capital that will be spent later. A mentor who offers career-defining help may expect a loyalty that was never explicitly discussed. When favors become influence, the ethical terrain grows complicated. The reciprocity norm is not inherently manipulative. It is the foundation of gift economies, of friendship, of social fabric. The question is always one of intent and transparency. A genuine gift, given without expectation, is one of the most beautiful things humans do for each other. A calculated gift designed to create obligation is something else entirely, and the fact that it activates the same psychological mechanism is precisely what makes it effective and what makes it worth understanding. The defense is simple in principle and difficult in practice. Notice when you feel obligated. Ask whether the gift was invited. Distinguish between genuine gratitude and manufactured debt, and grant yourself the freedom to receive without necessarily owing, particularly when the gift arrived uninvited from someone who wants something from you. Chapter 7. The Seventh Veil, Chains of Commitment. It is easier to prevent bad habits than to break them. Benjamin Franklin. In the 1960s, researchers Jonathan Friedman and Scott Fraser knocked on doors in a quiet California neighborhood and asked homeowners if they would be willing to allow a large, somewhat ugly drive, carefully signed, to be installed on their lawn. Only 17% agreed. But in a second group of homeowners, the researchers had visited 2 weeks earlier with a different, much smaller request. Would residents be willing to display a small, 3-inch "Be a Safe Driver" sticker in their window? Almost everyone said yes. When the researchers returned 2 weeks later with the request for the large lawn sign, the compliance rate jumped to 76%. A tiny, almost trivial initial commitment had more than quadrupled the likelihood of a major one. This is the foot in the door technique, and the mechanism behind it is one of the most powerful and pervasive forces in human psychology: the need for consistency. Human beings are deeply motivated to behave in ways consistent with their prior actions, their stated beliefs, and most critically, their self-image. This is not vanity. It is cognitive efficiency. Maintaining a stable self-concept reduces the constant mental work of reevaluating every decision from scratch. You are a person who exercises, or a person who doesn't, a person who supports a cause, or doesn't, a person who honors commitments, or doesn't. These categories are functional shortcuts that organize behavior. The problem is that these commitments, once made, can be exploited. Small decisions that bind future actions are precisely what skilled negotiators, salespeople, and political operatives engineer. Get someone to agree to the principle. Get them to affirm the value publicly. Get them to take any action, however minor, in the direction of the desired outcome, and then watch as the need for self-consistency pulls them along the rest of the path. This is why car dealers show you the car before finalizing the price. Why subscription services offer free trials that require a credit card. Why charity campaigns ask you to sign an online petition before asking for money. Each of these is a small commitment that makes a larger one feel consistent, rather than new. Identity as a prison of choice is perhaps the most profound aspect of consistency pressure. When people are persuaded to identify with a label, I am a generous person, I am someone who cares about the environment, I am a loyal customer, that label shapes behavior, often for years. Research by Cialdini found that people who were told you seem like the kind of person who votes were significantly more likely to vote in subsequent elections than people given identical information without the identity, affirming, framing. The label creates an internal standard. Violating it produces cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable feeling of acting inconsistently with your self-concept. Most people will reshape their behavior to eliminate the dissonance, rather than revising the self-concept. The quiet force of internal pressure that consistency generates is almost undetectable from the inside. It doesn't feel like pressure. It feels like integrity. It feels like being true to yourself. And often, it is. But when the initial commitment was strategically engineered to lead somewhere you wouldn't have chosen freely, when the first sticker was placed to make the lawn sign inevitable, the chains of consistency become chains of manipulation. Notice your prior commitments. Notice when someone is asking for something small just to get started, and give yourself explicit permission to change your mind, publicly, without shame, when new information or deeper reflection warrants it. Consistency is a virtue, but it should be in service of your values, not a lever in someone else's hands. Chapter 8. The Eighth Veil, the Power of the Many. It is dangerous to be right in matters on which the established authorities are wrong. Voltaire. On April 29, 1951, a young psychologist named Solomon Asch placed a test subject in a room with 7 other people and showed them a series of lines. The task was absurdly simple. Which of 3 comparison lines matched the standard line in length? The answer was visually obvious, the kind of question a child could answer correctly. But all 7 other people in the room were Confederates. Actors instructed to give the same wrong answer, confidently and unanimously. And what Asch found was this. When faced with unanimous social pressure, 75% of participants gave an obviously incorrect answer at least once. Many did so multiple times. Afterward, when interviewed, some participants admitted they had doubted themselves. Others had actually begun to perceive the lines differently. Social proof, the tendency to look to others' behavior as evidence of what is correct, is among the most powerful and most exploited of all influence mechanisms. It runs so deep because it makes evolutionary sense. In a complex world where information is limited, watching what the majority does is often a reliable heuristic. If everyone around you is running, the rational move may be to run first and ask questions later. The comfort of the crowd is not foolishness. It is pattern recognition at scale, but it becomes dangerous when the crowd itself has been manufactured, when the consensus is fabricated, or when the social proof is constructed around an outcome that serves someone else's interests. Canned laughter in television sitcoms was introduced not because audiences requested it, but because research showed it made shows feel funnier. And more importantly, made individual audience members laugh more. Tracks manufacture social proof for humor. If everyone around you is laughing, you're more likely to experience something as funny. This principle translates directly to online review systems, bestseller lists, social media follower counts, and political rallies. Why doubt seeks confirmation in others is a feature of human cognition described in detail by Festinger's theory of social comparison. We evaluate our own opinions and abilities by comparing them to those of others, particularly others we see as similar to ourselves. When we are uncertain, we are especially susceptible to social influence, and skilled communicators learn to introduce uncertainty before presenting the social consensus. Collective belief as perceived truth shapes behavior in contexts far beyond consumer choice. Research on health behavior shows that people are more likely to change behaviors like smoking, exercise, and diet when they believe the social norm around them has shifted, not just when given factual information. The DARE program, one of the most extensively studied anti-drug programs in American history, was found in multiple rigorous evaluations to be ineffective, partly because it inadvertently communicated how many teenagers use drugs, increasing the perceived social norm for drug use. The pull of belonging is perhaps the most human of all forces we will discuss in this book. Exclusion from one's social group was, for most of human evolutionary history, effectively a death sentence. The social pain of rejection activates the same neural pathways as physical pain, and the fear of that exclusion shapes behavior powerfully and largely unconsciously. When you recognize social proof being deployed, when you see the live audience count, the 5 stars, 10,000 reviews, the everyone on your street has signed up, give yourself a moment. Ask, would this choice be right for me if no one else were making it? Chapter 9, The Ninth Veil, The Shaping of Reality. Whoever controls the language controls the mind. George Orwell. In 1969, a linguist named George Lakoff argued something that would take decades to fully penetrate public consciousness. We don't just describe reality with language. We experience reality through language. The words available to us shape what we can perceive, what we can feel, and what we can imagine. Today, this insight is the cornerstone of modern political communication, advertising strategy, and behavioral design. It is the art of framing, and it is operating on you right now in this sentence, in every headline you read today. Consider the phrase estate tax versus death tax. Both describe the same policy, a tax levied on large inheritances. One sounds like a technical term, applying to wealthy estates. The other sounds like the government taxing death itself. Polling data from the early 2000s showed that public support for the policy shifted by more than 20 percentage points, simply based on which label was used. The policy hadn't changed. The words had. This is framing as a subtle force. Not lying, necessarily. Not even misleading, necessarily. Simply choosing from among the accurate descriptions of something the one that activates the emotional and cognitive associations most favorable to a particular outcome. Words as instruments of perception work at every scale, from individual conversations to global narratives. Research by Lakoff himself, and extended by later cognitive scientists, showed that abstract concepts are understood through metaphor. We grasp an idea, construct an argument, attack a position, defend our views. These are not dead metaphors. They activate neural networks associated with physical experience, which in turn shape what we find plausible, what feels dangerous, and what counts as a solution. When a government describes border control as stemming a flood, that metaphor activates associations of danger, overwhelm, and necessary force. When activists describe the same situation as welcoming the displaced, the metaphor activates hospitality, humanity, and moral responsibility. Neither may be a lie. Both are profoundly influential constructions. Narratives that redefine truth are perhaps the most powerful application of language as influence. Humans are, at the neurological level, story processing creatures. Research by psychologist Jerome Bruner demonstrated that information presented in narrative form, with characters, causality, emotion, and resolution, is processed more deeply, recalled more accurately, and believed more readily than the same information, presented as abstract. This is why statistics rarely move people and stories do. A single identified individual, with a name, a face, a specific story, generates more charitable giving and more political action than data, representing thousands. Paul Slovic's research on what he called the collapse of compassion showed that as the number of victims in a crisis increases, people's emotional response actually decreases. One child's story could generate millions in donations. Telling people about 8 children's stories generated less. The arithmetic of suffering does not match the arithmetic of attention, seeing not what is, but what is shown, recognizing the frame rather than disappearing inside it, is the essential cognitive act of resistance. Every time you encounter information, ask, what alternatives could have been chosen to describe this? What is being highlighted? What is in the background? What word was selected? And what would change if a different word were used? Language shapes thought. Whoever frames the conversation controls the ground on which it stands. Your job is to notice when you're standing on someone else's ground, and to feel free to step off it. Chapter 10. The 10th Veil, Silence and Absence. The right word may be effective, but no word was ever as effective as a rightly timed pause. Mark Twain. We talk a great deal about the power of words. We spend considerably less time thinking about the power of their absence. Yet silence, withdrawal, and mystery are among the most sophisticated instruments in the influencer's repertoire, and paradoxically, the hardest to defend against, because there is nothing to argue with, nothing to resist, nothing to call out. The tension of what is not said creates a vacuum. And human minds, as we have discussed, hate vacuums. When information is withheld, we do not simply note the gap and move on. We fill it. We fill it with assumption, with projection, with the most emotionally available explanation, which is rarely the neutral one. Consider the phenomenon of the silent treatment in interpersonal relationships. Research in social psychology has documented that social exclusion and ostracism, being ignored by someone who previously engaged with you, activates the same neural pain pathways as physical injury. More significantly, being ignored by someone is generally more distressing than being actively argued with. Argument at least acknowledges your existence. Silence erases it. This is why strategic withdrawal is such a potent tool in interpersonal dynamics. The sudden disappearance of attention, pulling back warmth, becoming unavailable, reducing communication, creates anxiety in the other party that can drive significant behavioral changes. It requires no persuasion, no argument, no confrontation. The absence does the work. The gravity of withdrawal has been studied extensively in romantic psychology. Research on attachment theory, pioneered by John Bowlby and later extended by researchers like Philip Shaver, shows that individuals with anxious attachment styles, who have internalized uncertainty about whether care will be available, are particularly vulnerable to withdrawal as an influence mechanism. The threat of abandonment, even a subtle one, triggers pursuit behavior that can override considered judgment. Mystery as a force of attraction operates on related principles. Uncertainty about another person, an idea, or a situation generates a state of active cognitive engagement. We keep returning to the subject, turning it over, seeking resolution. This is why incompleteness is more compelling than satisfaction. A piece of music that ends on an unresolved chord stays in the mind longer than one that concludes neatly. An unfinished story haunts us in a way that a concluded one does not. The Zeigarnik effect, first described by Soviet psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik in 1927, demonstrated that people remember uncompleted tasks significantly better than completed ones. The incomplete creates a kind of psychic open loop that the mind keeps returning to. Skilled storytellers, teachers, and yes, manipulators use this effect deliberately, creating questions that demand answers, problems that demand resolution, absences that demand presence. Influence through restraint is perhaps the most elegant and least recognized of all the mechanisms in this manuscript. The person in the room who speaks least often commands the most attention when they do speak. The product released in limited quantities generates more interest than one freely available. The relationship in which one party consistently gives less attention generates more longing than one of even exchange. The lesson here cuts in a liberating direction. You do not always need more words, more effort, more persuasion. Sometimes the most powerful move is to say nothing, to wait, to allow the other person's mind to do the work. But be careful with this tool. Silence is powerful precisely because it is felt deeply. Used carelessly or cruelly, it causes real harm. Chapter 11, the 11th veil, the moment of weakness. Timing is everything in life and in business. Harvey Mackay. Every negotiator, every therapist, every skilled salesperson, every general in the history of warfare has understood the same fundamental truth. It is not enough to have the right message. You must deliver it at the right moment. In fact, the same request, the same offer, the same argument, presented at two different points in time to the same person, can succeed brilliantly or fail completely. Timing is not decoration, it is strategy. The science of decision-making moments is detailed and counterintuitive. A landmark 2011 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences analyzed over 1,100 parole board decisions made by Israeli judges over a 10-month period. The findings were startling. Prisoners who appeared before the board after a meal break were granted parole at rates of approximately 65%. Prisoners who appeared at the end of a session just before a break were granted parole at rates approaching 0%, regardless of the nature of the crime, the prisoner's history, or the legal merits of the case. The judge's mental state, specifically their level of decision fatigue, determined the fate of hundreds of individuals more powerfully than the evidence. This is what psychologists call ego depletion. As the mental resource of self-regulation is exhausted through use, decisions increasingly default to the simple option, which in the context of parole is denial. Emotional openings and vulnerability create different kinds of timing opportunities. Research on prosocial behavior shows that people are significantly more generous, more willing to donate, volunteer, or help immediately following emotionally moving experiences. After a powerful film, a meaningful conversation, or even a piece of music that touched them, people briefly inhabit a more open emotional state. That window is real, and it closes. When resistance fades is equally a function of timing. The phenomenon of choice fatigue described in Barry Schwartz's work and validated extensively by Roy Baumeister's research on decision depletion shows that after making many small decisions, the capacity for careful deliberation on subsequent ones is genuinely diminished. Shopping mall design, legal deposition schedules, and interview processes are all, consciously or not, built around this fact. Precision over pressure is the key insight here. Applying force to a closed door achieves little, but a door that is ajar requires only the lightest touch. The skilled influencer, whether ethical or otherwise, waits for or creates the conditions in which the other person is most open to new information, new perspectives, and new commitments. This principle has profound implications for how we protect ourselves. If you know you are in a state of depletion, tired, emotionally raw, hungry, overwhelmed, then you know you are in a vulnerable window. Any significant decision made in that state deserves to be revisited when resources are restored. Sleep on it is not mere caution. It is neurologically grounded wisdom. It also has implications for when we have important conversations. If you need someone to genuinely hear you, to consider something carefully, to make a decision that matters, bring them that conversation when they are rested, fed, and emotionally at ease. Not because you are manipulating them, but because you respect them enough to give their best judgment the chance to operate. Chapter 12, the 12th veil, resistance and reversal. The harder you push people, the harder they push back. Brian Tracy. Here is a paradox that every parent, every manager, and every salesperson eventually discovers. Sometimes the fastest way to get people to do something is to tell them not to. We have already touched on psychological reactance in the context of scarcity, but it deserves a chapter of its own because the dynamics of resistance are central to understanding how influence actually works in practice, and they are frequently misunderstood by people who rely too heavily on direct pressure. The nature of opposition in human psychology is not simple stubbornness. When a person feels that their freedom to think, choose, or act is being constrained, they experience reactance, a motivational state that specifically drives them toward the restricted option, toward the opposite of what they are being pushed toward. This is not a rational response. It is automatic, deep-seated, and powerful. Jack Braham's foundational 1966 research on reactance has been replicated across dozens of contexts. In one memorable demonstration, researchers posted signs near a fountain with two different messages. Do not write on these walls under any circumstances. And simply, please don't write on these walls. The absolutist prohibition produced significantly more graffiti. Reactance explains why teenagers who are told they cannot see someone often become intensely attached to that person. It explains why governments that ban books regularly create bestsellers. It explains why heavy-handed health campaigns, "You must stop smoking," often outperform in generating resistance what more collaborative approaches achieve in generating change. The paradox of indirect influence is that the route to agreement is often not through argument, but through invitation. Research by William Miller and Stephen Rolenik, whose motivational interviewing technique has been extensively validated in addiction treatment and health behavior change, shows that directly arguing against a person's position strengthens rather than weakens their attachment to it. The person is now defending their view, and in defending it, elaborating it, and in elaborating it, becoming more committed to it. When pushing creates distance, the skilled communicator pivots. Instead of pushing against resistance, they find ways to present choices as freely made. You could try either approach. What feels right to you is far more effective than you should do X for audiences with high reactance. The choice is still being shaped, the options are still being curated, but the person's sense of autonomy is preserved, and with it, their sense that the eventual choice is genuinely their own. Guiding without force is the highest skill level in influence. It requires patience, self-restraint, and a genuine respect for the other person's agency, because forcing that respect, as we have seen, is self-defeating. The most successful educators, therapists, parents, and leaders share this quality. They create conditions in which people arrive at conclusions themselves, and those self-arrived conclusions become the most durable kind of change. There is something almost Zen-like about this. The more you try to hold water, the faster it escapes. The more you hold the vessel open and wait, the more it fills. Influence at its most sophisticated is often invisible, not because it is hidden, but because it requires so little that there is nothing to see. The 13th veil, the self is illusion. We are what we repeatedly do. Aristotle. Who are you? Not your name, not your job title, not the collection of facts you'd list on a resume. I mean the deeper thing, the identity you carry through your life as the continuous, consistent, authentic you. The unsettling truth, supported by decades of social psychology and cognitive science, is that the self is far more constructed, far more fluid, and far more susceptible to external influence than we typically believe. This does not mean you are fake. It means that what you take to be your core identity is, in substantial part, a narrative, a story you tell about yourself, built from the feedback of others, the labels you've accepted, the communities you've joined, and the consistency demands you've fulfilled. Identity as a constructed narrative is not a new idea in philosophy. William James wrote about it in 1890. Irving Goffman described social identity as performance in 1959. But the behavioral evidence for how identity shapes behavior and how it can be shaped has never been more detailed or more precise than it is today. The need to remain consistent with self-image drives behavior across an extraordinary range of domains. Research on the what the hell effect in dietary restraint shows that dieters who have made one dietary slip off and abandon their dietary goals entirely for the rest of the day. The logic examined consciously makes no sense. One cookie does not justify a pizza. But the identity script, I am a person who is dieting, has been violated, and once violated, the instinct to restore consistency can paradoxically be fulfilled by abandoning the effort entirely rather than continuing it imperfectly. Labels that shape behavior are among the most powerful and least visible influence. In a landmark study by Robert Cialdini and colleagues, students who were told by their teacher that they looked like thoughtful students who cared about their schoolwork showed significantly improved academic performance in subsequent weeks, compared to students who received equally positive but non-identity-based praise. The label created a self-concept that behavior then sought to honor. This principle is at the core of successful long-term behavior change programs. Alcoholics Anonymous famously does not ask members to pledge never to drink again. It asks them to identify as an alcoholic, a label that restructures the self-concept and aligns behavior with the new identity. Weight Watchers research has found that members who begin to identify as a healthy person who is managing their relationship with food rather than a dieter maintain their results significantly longer, becoming what one believes is both the promise and the peril of identity-based influence. When the identity is genuinely chosen, when it reflects the person's authentic values, and when it is freely embraced, it becomes one of the most powerful tools for personal transformation available. When it is strategically assigned by a cult, a political movement, a manipulative relationship, a corporation, the same mechanism becomes a trap. The question to carry with you: which of my identities did I choose, and which were chosen for me? Which labels am I living up to because they are genuinely mine? And which ones am I honoring because someone handed them to me at a vulnerable moment, and I never thought to put them down? Chapter 14. The Abyss. When influence corrupts. Power does not corrupt men. Fools, however, if they get into a position of power, corrupt power. George Bernard Shaw. We need to stop here and look honestly at what can go wrong. Everything we have discussed in this book, every mechanism, every principle, every veil, can be used in service of genuine connection, ethical leadership, effective teaching, and meaningful help. And every single one of them can be weaponized. The same understanding that helps a nurse recognize when a patient is being pressured into an unwanted medical decision can help a predator isolate a victim. The same knowledge of social proof that helps a public health campaign normalize healthy behavior can help a demagogue normalize hatred. The descent from awareness to control is not always dramatic. It often begins with small rationalizations. I know what's best for them. They would agree if they just thought it through. The end justifies the means. It's not manipulation if I'm right. These are the first steps down a slope that does not announce itself as a slope. Real consequences of manipulation have been extensively documented. Philip Zimbardo, whose Stanford prison experiment in 1971, later disputed in methodology, but foundational in implication, showed how quickly ordinary people adopt abusive roles when given institutional authority and permission. Spent years afterward studying what he called the Lucifer effect, the conditions under which good people do terrible things. His conclusion was uncomfortable. The conditions matter far more than the character. Given the right structural incentives and cultural permissions, almost anyone can become an instrument of harm. The erosion of trust and connection is perhaps the most immediate and measurable damage caused by manipulative influence. A 2019 meta-analysis by researchers at the University of Michigan examined outcomes in relationships where one partner had used consistent deceptive or coercive influence techniques. The findings were consistent across studies. Even when the deception was never discovered, the manipulating partner showed significantly lower relationship satisfaction, lower trust in others generally, and higher rates of anxiety and depression over time. Manipulation corrodes the manipulator. Not always. Some people show remarkable resilience to this damage, particularly those who have rationalized their behavior extensively. But the act of treating another human being primarily as an object to be moved, rather than a subject to be engaged, costs something. It diminishes the space for genuine intimacy, genuine surprise, genuine relationship. When you cannot be honest about your motives, you cannot be fully known. Power without restraint operates according to a principle that history has demonstrated repeatedly. Unchecked power amplifies whatever is already present. In a person of genuine wisdom and care, broader influence can mean broader positive impact. In a person who has rationalized harm, it means more efficient harm. The capacity for influence is morally neutral. The character of the person wielding it is not. This chapter exists not to frighten you, but to be honest with you. The knowledge in this manuscript is genuinely double-edged. If you choose to use it against people, to manipulate rather than persuade, to coerce rather than invite, to exploit vulnerability rather than honor it, you will likely be effective in the short term. And you will pay a price that compounds quietly over time, in the quality of your relationships, in the trust others place in you, and in the story you are able to tell yourself about who you are. That price is real, and it is worth knowing about before you choose. Chapter 15. Breaking the spell. The unexamined life is not worth living. Socrates. Now we turn to the work of defense, of liberation, of becoming, as much as possible, the author of your own choices, rather than a character in someone else's story. Recognizing influence in real time is a learnable skill, not a talent reserved for the especially perceptive, but a set of specific practices that anyone willing to put in the effort can develop. And the first practice is the most uncomfortable, accepting that you have been influenced, extensively and continuously, by forces you did not choose and did not notice. This acceptance is not defeat, it is the prerequisite for change. The person who believes they are immune to influence is the most susceptible person in any room, because their defenses are permanently down. The person who knows they can be influenced is the person who can watch for it. Questioning emotional reactions is the practice of inserting a pause between feeling and acting. This does not mean suppressing emotion or dismissing it. It means becoming curious about it. When you feel sudden urgency about a purchase, ask, where did this urgency come from? Was it there before I entered the store? When you feel inexplicable anxiety about a political situation, ask, what am I consuming that might be generating this anxiety? And is the anxiety proportionate to the actual threat? When you feel an unexpected pull towards someone or something, ask, what conditions were created to produce this pull? The neuroscientific basis for this practice lies in what researchers call affect labeling, the practice of putting emotional experiences into words. So, a landmark series of studies by Matthew Lieberman at UCLA showed that labeling an emotion, I feel afraid right now, reduces activity in the amygdala and increases activity in the prefrontal cortex. Literally naming what you feel reduces its automatic power over your behavior. Reclaiming independent thought requires more than individual vigilance. It requires seeking out genuine alternatives, not just the alternatives offered within a given frame, but alternatives to the frame itself. If you find yourself choosing between option A and option B and feeling urgency about the choice, the first question is whether those were the only available options and who decided they were. Media literacy is a critical component of this work. Research by psychologist Sander van der Linden at Cambridge University led to the development of what he calls inoculation theory, the finding that briefly exposing people to weakened doses of misinformation techniques, accompanied by explanation of the technique, significantly increases their resistance to those techniques when encountered in full strength. You become resistant to manipulation by learning how it works, which is precisely what this book is for. Awareness as protection is not a one-time achievement. It is a daily practice, like physical fitness. The conditions that make influence effective: depletion, emotional arousal, time pressure, social isolation, information overload, are permanent features of modern life. The practice of resistance must be equally permanent. Be patient with yourself. You will be influenced. You will catch yourself having made a choice under conditions designed to undermine your freedom, and you will feel the familiar mixture of embarrassment and frustration. That feeling is not failure. It is evidence that your awareness is working. The spell is beginning to break. Chapter 16. The Final Law: Mastery Without Corruption. The measure of a man is what he does with power. Plato. We have come a long way together. Through 16 veils, through the machinery of the human mind, through the anatomy of every technique that has ever been used to move a person without their full awareness. And now we arrive at the question that the whole book has been building toward. What will you do with this? The difference between awareness and domination is not merely a matter of technique. It is a matter of orientation toward the person in front of you. Do you see them as an obstacle to be moved, a resource to be harvested, a problem to be solved? Or do you see them as a subject? Complex, autonomous, worthy of genuine engagement. This is not sentimentality. It is the most practical thing in this book, because the evidence across relationship science, organizational psychology, and long-term persuasion research points consistently in one direction. Relationships built on genuine respect and honest communication outperform those built on manipulation in every outcome that matters over time. Cialdini himself, in his later work Persuasion, made explicit what his earlier research implied. The most effective long-term influence is not tricks, but trust. Persuasion, the practice of creating the right conditions for a message before delivering it, works best when it is aligned with genuine value, genuine care, and genuine honesty about what is being offered. Influence as responsibility is the framework I want to leave you with. Every time you communicate, you are influencing. Every time you speak, write, design, teach, parent, lead, or love, you are shaping someone else's world. There is no neutral communication. The question is only whether that influence is conscious, ethical, and oriented toward the flourishing of the other person, or unconscious, exploitative, and oriented toward your own short-term interest. Building trust instead of control requires giving things up. It requires honesty that sometimes costs you. It requires allowing people to say no. It requires presenting the full picture rather than the curated version. It requires respecting a no and not deploying a 5-step technique to reverse it. This is harder. It is slower. And it builds something that manipulation cannot. Genuine loyalty, genuine respect, and the kind of relationship in which both parties are genuinely free. Research by John Gottman at the University of Washington, accumulated over 4 decades of studying couples, found that the single strongest predictor of relationship longevity was not passion, not compatibility, not even communication skill. It was what he called positive sentiment override, a fundamental orientation of trust and goodwill toward the partner that allowed conflicts to be navigated without fundamental threat to the relationship. That orientation cannot be manufactured by technique. It must be earned by character. True power, clarity, not coercion. The person who understands influence and chooses transparency is the most powerful person in any room, not because they can move others without being noticed, but because they don't need to. Their clarity, their honesty, their genuine care for the people they engage with makes them magnetic in a way no technique can replicate. You have spent this book learning the anatomy of influence. Now you know the levers. The final question is not whether you will pull them. You will, as everyone does, constantly and inevitably. The question is, in whose direction, toward whose flourishing, and at what cost to the humanity of everyone involved. Use this knowledge well. Use it honestly. Use it with your eyes open. That is all that was ever asked of anyone who saw clearly. The end. The price of knowing. With great power comes great responsibility. Voltaire. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes with this kind of knowledge. Once you have seen the mechanisms, truly seen them, not just intellectually cataloged them, but viscerally recognized them, operating in real time, in the people and spaces you love, you cannot unsee them. A politician you previously admired now sounds different. A commercial that once seemed charming now reveals its architecture. A conversation with a family member surfaces its invisible pressures. This can be disorienting. It can feel like a loss. There is something genuinely beautiful about the unself-conscious trust of someone who has never thought about this, who simply gives and receives, influences and is influenced, without the constant quiet hum of awareness. Innocence has its own grace. The isolation of awareness is real, but it is also temporary. As you live with this knowledge longer, as it becomes integrated rather than intrusive, the hum quiets. You develop a lighter touch, the ability to notice without always commenting, to see without always naming, to see without always naming. You can choose when to deploy the full analytical attention and when to simply be present in a relationship without dissecting it. The responsibility of knowledge is not to be permanently suspicious. It is to be discerning, to bring full attention to decisions that matter, to protect your own autonomy while genuinely respecting the autonomy of others, to use your understanding of human psychology in the service of the best version of every relationship you are in, not as a toolkit for advantage, but as a language for genuine understanding. The final choice, how you will use what you now understand, is yours in a way that nothing in this book has tried to constrain. I have deliberately not told you what to think. I have tried to show you how thinking works, how it is shaped, and how it can be reclaimed. What you do with that is entirely up to you. Here is what I genuinely believe, and why I wrote this. Most people who understand influence use it more ethically, not less. Because knowledge of the mechanism comes with knowledge of its cost. Because you can no longer pretend that your communication is neutral, which means you bear responsibility for it. Because seeing manipulation clearly, in others and in yourself, makes it less attractive and less comfortable to deploy. The world contains people who will study the same mechanisms you have studied here and draw the opposite conclusion. That knowledge of vulnerability is permission to exploit it. There is nothing in psychology or philosophy that can prevent this. All that can be done is to ensure that more people who care about the difference between persuasion and manipulation, between influence and coercion, between power and trust, are equally equipped. You are now among them. Go carefully. Go honestly. And remember that the person in front of you, whatever situation you are in, whatever you want from them, whatever pressure you are under, is a full human being with their own veils, their own history, and their own right to choose freely. That right is sacred, protected in them and in yourself. Everything else follows.